All right, everyone. Welcome to the third session in our self-editing class with Roz Morris. Let's get started. I'll give Roz a brief introduction for those who might not be aware of her background. She's an author, a book doctor, a writing coach, and a ghostwriter. She has extensive experience as both an editor and novelist and has been longlisted for the World Fantasy Award. She teaches a masterclass for the Guardian newspaper and is a regular on the Litopia pop-up submission show where she critiques manuscripts alongside a literary agent, Peter Cox. So Roz, I'll turn it over to you and I won't jump in unless there's a burning question.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can get the screen share working first of all. So last time I forgot to press the green button. There's the green button. And share that. And then this. And hopefully we should, there.
Beautiful.
Here we go. Thank you everyone for your messages as I'm seeing them as you joined. I'm so pleased you're finding this helpful. I find this such a creative process and I hope that you're feeling that too. This isn't kind of the end of you working on your novel. This is, I think, the beginning of you doing the most interesting work on your novel or your memoir or narrative nonfiction. So in the first session, we considered how self-editing is an in-depth process. It's a thorough assessment and understanding of the hidden structures and mechanisms of your book. And through a tool called the Beat Sheet, we learned how to do that with confidence and how to think about your book's elements in a critical and constructive way so that you understand how to engage the reader and satisfy them, whatever kind of book you're writing. How to keep their attention, how to assess your characters, plot, story, pace, structure, and how to acquire a critical mindset so that you understand what your book is and how to do what's best for it. And ultimately, that is what this tool is for. It's to train you to have the mindset to think about your work in a way that is creative, but also craftsmanlike. And so today we'll consider all the other aspects of a thorough revision. So that's writing style, language, and other points of fine-tuning. So the next points that follow will be quite generalized because you will write loads of different things. The details will vary according to what you're writing. But what I'll do is give you a set of universal tools and principles for making sure you hit the right notes for your kind of book. The first is tone and genre expectations. And we're going to use the Beat Sheet, the trusty Beat Sheet for this. Look at the emoticons to check how these are working. If you're writing a thriller, have you got enough thrilling bits? If you're writing a comedy, do you have enough laughs? If you're writing a character or a literary piece, do you have enough focus on the individual experience, the complexities of character, the personalities creating the problems? Those will all be apparent in the descriptions of the purpose of a scene as well as in the emoticons. All the information is there for you to see. And a more essential question, did you start by intending to write one sort of book and end up writing another? And this happens, and it's fine if it does. Your first draft is just kind of the storming draft where you let the book tumble out of your brain. Now, though, when you put it together, you need to decide what exactly it is. So look at your emoticons because they will tell you the predominant emotions of the scenes and whether you're trying to make the reader amused by what's happening generally or whether you're trying to create a sense of mystery and dread. Sometimes we don't realize we've created something different from what we originally thought we were creating, but it will be in the emoticons. Here's another point about tone. You certainly want variety. As I said, the reader needs a breather from scenes of similar emotional temperature. You need relief from too much tension. You need a funny moment every now and again, but you do need an overall sense of consistency. And this shows most commonly in the way that you handle those funny or lighter scenes compared with the way you handle the serious scenes. They have to look as though they belong in the same book. I'll illustrate a bit more about this. I often see manuscripts where the author has written their funny bits and their serious bits in completely different voices. There's no problem with that if you're drafting and feeling your way, but at some point you have to draw it together so that it works as one work. And comedy books and light-hearted books are written with quite a different tone, quite a different sort of heart from serious books. And it doesn't work if you switch between them in the same book. And there are two ways that I found that writers make their tone uneven in this way. The first is the writing style. So they write the funny bits as though they, the writer, are very amused by them, and often with words that sound comic. And then they write the serious bits without nudging the reader to find everything amusing. And that just is very jarring. It's very strange for the reader. And the remedy for this is to rewrite so that both elements sound even. The second way this goes wrong is with the events. So one part of the plot will have quite slapstick and ridiculous events, while the other is very tragic. And the remedy for this might be quite drastic. They might actually be two separate books. The events of one storyline simply might not belong in the same tonal universe as the events of another. Now, this is a question of grade, though. You might have a set of characters to whom funnier things happen, but they won't be really slapstick compared with very tragic. It's a question of making them mesh together as though they belong in the same place. So you need to make your funny bits and your serious bits belong together. Comedy in a more serious book has to arise more quietly, and it's usually from the characters and their actions and reactions, or from ironies, rather than from the author nudging the reader to find it funny and just finding everything funny. It's a subtle difference, but that is usually how you solve this problem. However, it is tricky to maintain a consistent tone in a long work of prose. The writing takes a long time, and so does the editing. And on different days, you will simply feel in different moods while you're working on a book. So for these reasons, I found it's easier to actually disregard the narrative tone until I've done quite a lot of other work. And then when everything else is in place, you can start to fine-tune the tone. And I do use certain tools to help me find a tone and then keep it consistent. Music is really helpful for this. I often have soundtracks for books I'm working on, and they help me start in a consistent emotional place and think of the right kind of words and the right kind of atmosphere. Another thing I find very useful is to have certain novels or pieces of narrative nonfiction that will also put me in the right mood. I often keep a few touchstone novels and memoirs for each book that I'm working on, so that I can dip into them and think, oh, yes, this is what I want to come off the page. And they just put me in the right frame of mind. And poetry does a similar thing for me as well. I find it particularly useful if I want to think in a very non-factual style. If I find I'm explaining things too much, when actually I'd be better trying to encourage the reader towards a feeling, I pick up a book of poetry and have a look at that, and then it tunes my mind into different ways of expressing these facts so that the reader actually starts to feel more and experience more instead of just getting information. And I actually have a blog where I've collected people who use music in their writing practice. It's called The Undercover Soundtrack. And I started it when I wrote a novel about a pianist. And I found that it was just that music was helping me literally create events and plot twists. And I wondered if anyone else did this. And I actually found loads and loads of writers have, and they write about this on this blog. If you look for The Undercover Soundtrack, it's actually on the blog of My Memories of a Future Life. But people have come across amazing emotional realizations as a result of listening to music while writing or editing. One writer wrote about how she came up with the complete structure of her book by listening to the way two melody lines intertwined. It's a really powerful way of just setting your creativity free. So if that would work for you, then go and look that up. So I've used the beat sheet for most of this revision course, but now we're going to look at other aspects of style and presentation. So that's dialogue and theme, some tips for rewriting. Show not tell. No one has yet raised that in the chat room, but this is something we all have to think about. Chapter splits and beginnings. I did not forget beginnings, but we will do beginnings. So dialogue. Whole books are written about how to write dialogue, and it's one of the tricky writing disciplines. My main overall tip is this. Most authors find it easier to write dialogue and polish it on different days from the other kinds of writing. The mindset you need for dialogue, I think, is quite like acting. You have to get really inside various characters' heads, think of the immediacy of the moment. And that's different from the way you think when you're polishing the other elements of the narrative. So by far the easiest way to tackle dialogue is with a fresh head. And also, I would expect to make several passes on a dialogue scene, because you'll find that once you inhabit the characters' hearts, there are more interesting levels to each conversation. So I'll often revisit it for several days and I will find more depth and interest. And speaking of the depth and interest that you'll find in a dialogue scene, here are some examples. It's a lot more than just conveying information. Each time you might concentrate on a different aspect as you do a pass on a dialogue scene. It's really worthwhile because there's so much you can get out of them. These are 6 possible passes for a dialogue scene. So you can look for the individual characters' voices, whether they're distinct from each other, whether they sound enough like themselves. You can look for their true desires, which may come out in the dialogue exchange, or they may remain hidden, or they may get buried further as someone feels they can't say what they really feel. Look for their frustrations. And like the desires, they might be expressed or teased out, or they might be kept down and add an interesting tension. You can also look for hidden agendas. What does the character really want out of the conversation? Are they aware of it? Perhaps they are, perhaps they're not. Look for their particular personality. This is similar to the point about making sure their voices are distinct, but is there any aspect of a character's personality that you could make use of in the conversation? And lastly, don't forget your own subtext and themes. Are there any aspects of these that could add an interesting dimension to the dialogue scene? So that might be in a metaphor somebody chooses. It might just ping off your themes and your overall concerns. So let's discuss theme. First of all, what is it? Theme is the universal questions that seem to arise out of the story and the characters and the world of the book, and they give it a sense of weight. So it's not just a story about a small bunch of characters. It also seems to enact a universal truth or illuminate a part of life, or create the sense of a struggle that's common to us all. Your theme shines out of the book and gives it elegance and significance. And theme also gives a sense of coherence, a sense that everything just belongs together. In the same way as a limited colour palette can make a work of art look strong and sure of its purpose, as if it really knows what it's doing. Theme can do that. But there's a very important consideration with theme. Keep it mostly hidden. So here is a question to consider. What's your book about? And what's your book about in capital letters? One of them, the first about, is the story, situation, and the characters. The other, about, is all the underlying meaning, the heavy stuff, the wider relevance, the themes. And you have to be careful about this. Themes can get really heavy-handed if you focus too much on them. And it's an essential paradox of theme. Readers love noticing them. They don't like it, usually, if the themes are really laboured heavily. This is because the themes tend to be abstract patterns and intellectual observations. Remember what we were saying about plot twists, how they're effective because they have an emotional impact, because they matter to the characters and the reader cares what happens. And you have to make themes work in the same way. So although the reader is interested in themes and would like to feel they're there, the reader is not particularly emotionally excited by them. The reader is emotionally excited by people, people who do things that captivate them, make them curious. So you need to think of two kinds of abouts: the characters and their struggles, and the themes that seem to bubble up out of them, which the reader thinks they have noticed all by themselves, but which you have actually been carefully suggesting. So your about comes out of your about. However, theme can be very useful if you need to make your plot more substantial, or add a subplot, or tie a subplot more closely to the main plot if they don't seem to fit very well. So you can think of the possible themes your story has, and think of other ways to show it, and incorporate them as plot ideas. Here's an example of a writer using theme. The writer A.S. Byatt was talking about how she developed her novel Possession. She said she started with the idea that a dead writer could possess the lives of the people who study him. She then added ideas about possession, especially in relationships. She intended to juxtapose glimpses of poets and lovers through a series of theoretical tests and biographical material. And she said she intended it to be a presentation of her theme for the readers to study. Are you still awake? Then, she said, she read Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, and she noticed how the readers were really enjoying the medieval theology alongside the detective story. That's a really important word, enjoying. She said, and I quote, "The secret I saw was that if you tell a strong story, you can include anything else you need to include. So I started inventing a detective story." A story. You can probably see this was not her primary intention until she had that moment of epiphany. But all writers have blind spots, and she was clearly so consumed by gathering all her material and fascinated by it that she didn't think the story till quite late in the process. Anyway, themes and metaphors will enhance a good story, but they'll also sink a weak one because it will look like it's trying too hard. You've probably guessed I'm going to say this. You will have to make several passes on each scene, and that's fine. That's absolutely expected. So here's a list of all the elements that you need to get right. It doesn't matter what order you do them in, and some of them you'll be able to tackle simultaneously. But anyway, this is a checklist of everything that needs to be tuned up. The descriptions. Have you got enough to create the right atmosphere in a scene and to let the reader know what's going on? The choreography of action. This varies with the scene, but if you're writing a scene with quite a lot of physical action, it always seems to take much longer than if you've got a lot of people just chatting around a dinner table. If someone has to cross a room and pick up a candlestick, there is just loads of stuff that you have to consider. Do I need to tell them how long the candlestick is? The candlestick was the size of a truncheon. Wait, do people know what a truncheon is? There is so much with a choreographed action scene. So just expect that will take a long time. The mood of a scene is also something you have to focus on. Some scenes are really straightforward, but they might need a pass to check that the mood strikes the right note, especially if you're creating a complex effect. It's the equivalent of adjusting the lighting and the sound that's going on. You might need to fiddle a bit before it just hits the reader right. You might need a pass to check how well you're incorporating any necessary factual information and backstory or information about a character's personality. Indeed, you might then think it should be in an earlier scene so that it's just seeded more naturally. You might find that your scene's got weighed down by too much stuff you're having to explain. So you might go back and drop something in earlier. You'll probably need to do a special pass for dialogue. As we've already discussed, that may be several passes for you to balance all the things that a dialogue scene might do for you. You also want to do a pass to ensure that the scene has enough momentum and pace, that you keep the sense of things changing. And you might want to look back at your beat sheet to remind yourself of the purpose of the scene. And sometimes our sense of purpose can get lost after a few revisions. So the beat sheet is a useful way to reorientate yourself. And when you're considering the scene's purpose, you might want to step back and consider whether you've chosen the most interesting approach. Could you make it more surprising or poignant? Could you start it a little bit later, start it a little bit earlier? Could you do anything to make your theme shimmer out of it a little bit more? Is there an opportunity of getting some of your deeper meaning across? Or would that be heavy-handed? And lastly, after all that, you'll want to check that it reads in a fluid way. And that's a lot to consider. So you might try many versions of scenes, and that's good. I do this. I try dozens of versions until I find the one that best suits the book. And the secret of doing this, I found, is to use the outtakes file. When I suspect that I could adjust something, but I think I've got it 90% right, I just copy the version I've got and then continue editing. And then I don't have to worry that I'm going to ruin something. And I've actually found usually it doesn't. Usually I've made a breakthrough because there's something in me that was thinking, you could do more with this. You could make this work better for your book. So you'll be doing a lot of revising, but sometimes you hit a point where you can't see the wood for the trees. So here are some ideas to help you regain a perspective. Recharge with any of the materials you've gathered that help you keep your overall vision for the book. So that might be music, other novels or memoirs, poetry. Sometimes if I'm feeling lost in my book, I put its soundtrack on my MP3 player and I go running with it. And by the time I come back, I just feel I know the book again. I know what it should be. I know what to change and what to leave. And I mentioned earlier that you can look at your beat sheet to remind you of the purpose of a scene, or even see how it's changed. And that certainly happens. Another thing that really helps is to look at a much earlier version of the scene, even the first draft. Sometimes the early drafts, although they contain a load of rubbish, they also have fresh phrasing that has a real vitality and energy, because you often wrote in a spirit of discovery and you weren't self-conscious. You were just thinking, I'll get this down, it's coming out, it's great. And often that's what you need to provide the missing piece. Here's another really important point. Show, not tell. It's a dramatic principle, and it's often misunderstood. And people get themselves tied in knots trying to explain it. And it's also a much used comment on manuscripts when you're getting critical feedback. Show, not tell, you'll find written all over it. So what does it mean? Well, if you show the reader an event, you help them experience it. If you tell them about it, they don't experience it as vividly. And here's an example. He got wet. That's telling. He got wet. Spray from a passing car flew up into his eyes and trickled down inside his collar. His trainers squeezed out water with every step he walked. His jeans clung to his legs. That's showing. The reader is experiencing getting wet. Let's have the telling version again. He got wet. So I hope you can see the difference. The showing version is vivid and alive. It puts the reader right in the character's experience. So here are some notes about show, not tell. It might mean make a scene longer, but not always. You can show with brevity. It depends on the details that you pick. So for this picture here of the umbrellas, the telling version might be, she was different, or she stood out from the crowd. The brief showing version would be very specific. So it would be something like, she would always show up in the wrong kind of dress and she didn't care. The telling version again, she was different. The showing version again, she would always show up in the wrong kind of dress and she didn't care. Here's an illustration from real life. I also think a lot of writing principles actually have parallels in real life, and this is one. One of the best ways to really irritate someone is to keep telling them that a person they don't know is wonderful. Oh, she's marvelous. Oh, she's so different. Oh, she's great. Oh, she's lovely. This has perversely exactly the opposite effect. You very soon think that person is anything but lovely and marvelous and great. But I see this a lot in manuscripts. Many, many lines that go, he loved her so much. He got to pain when he thought of her. They're too vague and they seem empty. And very soon they get really irritating. And also it's not truthful. when we remember or think about someone, we don't actually think in summaries like this, she was marvelous. We actually remember experience. It's more like a flashback, for instance. Imagine you were searching for someone on a dark night and you were relieved to see their face. An instant feeling that says, oh, right, I've got an attachment to this person. They're marvelous and lovely to us. Here's a good way to remember. Showing tells us how. And here's another important point about show, not tell. Telling isn't actually bad. Telling is another important and useful part of narrative. And it's all a matter of emphasis. Sometimes it's enough to say, he fell out of the window. Sometimes you want to show a million life moments passing before the character's eyes, or the dread of what the outcome will be. It depends on what suits your story. And time is actually elastic in these cases. In Iris Murdoch's novel, The Sea, the viewpoint character falls off a cliff into the water. In real life, it's a couple of seconds. In the character's experience, it takes most of a page, and it feels completely real. There's another amazing example of this elasticity of time in Tim Winton's novel, Dirt Music. It's the moments after a car crash. Again, moments, even the time it took me to say that word, but it takes several pages. But conversely, you don't have to describe every event or moment. Sometimes it's fine to say they drove to Birmingham. If it doesn't matter how it feels to drive to Birmingham, you don't have to present that experience to the reader. And this brings me to a related point. Don't condense too much. Although we're editing out the fluff and we're refining the content of scenes and we're being really purposeful, it's possible to strip away too much. You need to keep the flow. Especially think about the purpose of the scene. Although we might know the purpose of the scene when we're looking at it on our beat sheet and we've got our revision plan, the purpose isn't usually apparent to the reader at the beginning. And it shouldn't be, because it's usually going to be a surprise. It's usually going to be the next step that we take the reader through. So the purpose you need to arrive at the purpose at a natural pace for the scene. So it needs to develop through action and dialogue and get there naturally. And you might wonder why I've put it in the section on show, not tell, because it's usually when this goes wrong, it's because writers have rushed a key experience. And funnily enough, this makes it lose its impact. I'll give an example from my own work. I had a scene in my novel Lifeform 3, and my agent said it was quite slow to read. So I looked at it again and I realised I'd actually rushed an emotional moment. So I added a lot of material. You'd expect probably that I should have cut it because it was reading slow, but I didn't. I added, and my agent then said, that reads much faster now. It read faster with more material because I'd included the missing emotional beats that kept the reader interested and engaged and able to follow what was going on. I'd got the right number of emotional beats. I'd created the viewpoint character's experience more fully and convincingly. And it's like the character falling off a cliff in Iris Murdoch's novel, or the character coming to after the car accident in Tim Winton's novel. These events take only moments, but in the character's mind, they last forever. And if you get this wrong, somehow the scene loses its grip on the reader's attention. They feel you've written something that drags and that you've bored them. But get it right, and it will read fast. So let's talk about chapter breaks. There's a big gear change. Here are a few principles for chapter breaks. Short chapters pull the reader onwards. Longer chapters give a leisurely feel. There are two main ways to end a chapter. It might be a cliffhanger, or it might be a new note of uncertainty, which will pull the reader onwards. Or you might end on a note of closure, to signal a conclusion to a particular phase of the story. This is less suspenseful, but sometimes it suits your purposes. I actually don't decide my chapter breaks until quite late in the editing, when I'm happy with the overall shape of the book, because that's the point where I can make decisions about the overall drive and what I want the reader to feel. So let's talk about beginnings. And you're bound to want to know, why have I left this so late? And it's because to write an effective beginning, you need to know your book very well and to realise its full potential through a lot of editing. And you might have a placeholder beginning, because you have actually got to start the manuscript somehow. And once you've done most of your other edits, you can look at that again, and you need to ask yourself certain questions. Have you started in the right place with the right events? If the beginning seems too slow, it might be because you're taking your time to warm the engine up. And that isn't a problem in an unfinished draft, but for the finished book, you need a beginning that works harder. Often you can find the perfect beginning by reading on a bit. In many manuscripts, I've often found a great beginning in chapter 3 or 4, when things have kind of got going and suddenly the writer has hit their stride. Is some of your beginning explanation and backstory? Again, this is a common problem with manuscripts. Writers front load the story with a load of explanations, and actually they'd be better slipping things in as needed and making more active use of it. You actually don't need nearly as much explanation as you think you need at the beginning. Here's a controversial subject: prologues. A prologue can make it look as though your story hasn't started properly. It usually concerns characters and situations that we aren't going to continue with in the first chapter, or it's used to provide a lot of explanation. Remember, in the section on characters, we talked about finding that a main character had disappeared, and readers actually can resent that. And actually prologues can make them feel like that too. The reader gets comfortable with someone and a place and a situation, and then they find they weren't very significant after all, or they're never seen again. And the reader might even think, this isn't the book I thought it was. And sometimes readers actually assume that the prologue isn't part of the story and they miss it out. So you're kind of stuck both ways. And agents and editors famously don't like prologues, and this is usually why. You're usually better to try and start at chapter 1. And sometimes you find if you simply rename the prologue as chapter 1, there was no real reason to make it a prologue anyway. And writers sometimes feel that if their prologue is a little bit before the main action, then they have to make it a prologue. But that doesn't matter. You can easily signal in the next chapter that a bit of time has passed, and it works just as well. But occasionally, a prologue is the only way to start the story, and they're welcomed in certain kinds of books, such as historical fiction and fantasy. The bottom line is this: use a prologue if you have a good reason to, but you might be better plunging straight in at chapter 1. So let's talk more about exactly what a beginning does. It does more than just start the book. These are the essentials. You have to grab attention, obviously. A reader will look at your book's opening and decide if it's going to keep their interest. So how do you do that? Well, you might do it with action. You might do it with a compelling and interesting problem for a character. And you might do it with an irresistible narrative voice. Now, when I say action, I don't mean it has to be something thrilling or exciting or punch-up. Do that if it fits your book, if that's one of the things your kind of reader will want. But action can also be low-key, if that's the kind of book you're writing. And what I mean by action in this context is a character doing something, perhaps making a choice or a decision. That is action. Or it could be something that the reader witnesses as it happens. It could be shooting a gun, or it could be stealing the tip off a table in a restaurant. It could be posting a job application in a letterbox full of hope. All action has to be as an interesting moment, as appropriate to your kind of reader, that the reader can share. And that kind of thing is also quite easy to understand, so you don't need loads of explanation. And this brings me to my next major point. The beginning will actually make a lot of promises to the reader about the nature of the story, themes and tones and concerns. This is another of the ways the reader is assessing your book as they read the opening. Are these the kind of characters they want to read about? Is your style and approach to their taste? If your book features a murder, there are many ways to write a story about a murder. So your beginning has to, in some way, show them what kind of murder story your book is, so that they can decide whether it's for them. The beginning also makes promises about the resolution. And now this might be overtly. For instance, the murder must be solved. Justice must be done. Or you might indicate that the journey and its conclusion will be more subtle through the way your style presents the action, or the themes that seem to shine out of the text, through your imagery and description. The opening of a book is like the overture to a long dramatic work of music, and it will in various ways prefigure the experience of the whole book, and it gets the reader ready for it. So you can see that in order to write a beginning that will do all of this, you need to know your book really thoroughly, which is one of the things that happens as you revise. Revision builds your familiarity with your book, its themes, its style, what it's interested in, what it isn't interested in. In all the decisions you make about what to keep and what to change, and the slant to put on things, and how you direct the reader's attention, you are learning what the book truly is. So when you've done all that, take another look at the beginning and see if it's the best way to set all this up, to send the reader on that journey you want them to take, to tune them to those things that you are most interested in, that you have presented most strongly and carefully. Also check that the beginning works in a self-contained way without you having to give too much explanation, that they can just slip into it reasonably easily. And that's why it's good to start with a piece of action, as appropriate, that's relatively easily understandable. The beat sheet again. As an exercise, try and make a beat sheet of a book you admire, as I did in my examples with Fahrenheit 451. There's a huge amount in that book that I didn't realise the author was doing until I analysed it step by step. And the beat sheet is a great way to do that. Just as you can X-ray your own book, you can X-ray someone else's to see how it works. So you might have a book you've abandoned or got stuck with. So here are a few extra tips. When you make the beat sheet of it, check if you have enough story. Perhaps you need to add more. Check if the characters are interesting and distinct enough, whether you should create more characters. Are they a bit kind of lonely in an empty world? Do you need to add more depth to them, or combine some to make one person who is more deeply realized? Also look at the point of view. Sometimes a book will actually unlock if you change the point of view. What if you write it in first person instead of third, or third instead of first, or use multiple narrators, or use an unreliable narrator, or the point of view of a child, or an elderly narrator, or change the tense to present? All these things could be the key to really maximizing the potential in your material. If you've decided to make a major overhaul of the structure and it looks too daunting, here's how to manage it. Write each scene on index cards, then sort them into the new order, check the effects of presenting the scenes in that order, and you might get interesting consequences that you hadn't thought of. You might also find plot holes. If you get plot holes, you can quickly sketch ways to fill them. And once you're happy with the new order of the scenes, I suggest you make a copy of the original text file, paste together the scenes in the new order, keep the old copies, you've still got that, paste it together in the new order, as if you're cutting a movie, really, and then make a beat sheet of this new version, checking for purpose and mood and tone, and see how it flows, and see if you like it better. Here's a very important editing rule. If you discover a significant problem, rejoice. It might seem like a pain in the backside, but you've actually made a really important diagnosis. You've seen something you didn't see before. You've discovered something that will make your book a lot better. And that's the purpose of revision. Remember, revision is constructive. It's understanding what you've made and how to present it in its best possible form. It's creative, even if you're cutting. So here are some other tips for smart revision. Check any facts. If you fudge a piece of information or fail to look it up, someone out there will know it. And this might spoil the credibility of your entire piece for them. Or it might even mean your plot doesn't work. Ideally, you should check everything as you include it. But if you haven't, the revision stage is where you make sure to check everything is as it should be. And when you later work with an editor, they are sure to flag anything that looks suspect. If you have checked everything, you can say, no, I checked that and it's all right. Check your descriptions are consistent. There are obvious things like eye colour or thinness or fatness, but also things like the histories of characters, including places that are significant to them. And the easiest way to do this is to build a dossier for each character if you haven't already. Be alert for darlings you should kill. And this can't be overstressed because it's so easy for us to keep passages for the wrong reasons. But I find that as I revise more and more thoroughly, I understand better what the book needs, and I find it easier to change or even remove the parts that I was reluctant to ditch at an earlier stage. I just get more confident with everything, and I feel like I know better where it's going. So it's worth asking yourself at various intervals, is there anything I'm clinging to that really should go? And another important point, allow every scene to evolve naturally. Don't rush. Remember, you know what the scene's purpose is, but the reader doesn't. Show, not tell, where appropriate. Also look how you start each scene. It's very easy to miss these details, and you have to get used to actually looking for it. Check that every scene starts by saying where it is, when it is, and who's there. It's one of the most frequent edit points I come across. So make sure you've told the reader the who, what, and where, and when. Also check for relics of your previous drafts. There might be plot ideas you seeded and then actually didn't use. But if you leave them in, they might mislead or confuse the reader and be unhelpful. Although you might decide that you like them because they just add more verisimilitude, but do question whether they need to be there. Finally, I will allow you to deal with the grammar and the spelling and the punctuation and the prettiness of the language. And you can probably now see that with all the other changes, it simply wasn't worth sweating over those details until you had the more major work sewn up. And indeed, if you spend too much time polishing the surface like this, it can make you reluctant to make other far more important changes because they might undo all your hard work and your beautiful lines. So I deliberately leave the manuscript quite rough until I'm happy that all the bigger requirements are satisfied. It's like building a house. You don't furnish the rooms or do the fine finishes until you know the walls are in the right place and the plumbing is in the right place and everything works and the power sockets are there. Just don't decorate it until you've done all that first. So people often ask me what to do with the beat sheet. I think it's worth keeping it. It remains a very useful document even after you've finished your revisions. I use it to prove the timeline. Very useful for that. I can't overstress how useful that is. By the time you're showing the manuscript to editors or beta readers, you might have forgotten all the hard work you did to establish exactly what works and where and when. And an editor particularly might not take your word for it because they'll feel personally responsible for making sure your timeline works. But if you can prove that you checked whether it's possible for a character to fly from New Zealand to London in the time allowed by something else that's going on, then put it in the beat sheet and you can just prove that you've already done the work and you don't have to do it again. But do remember to update the beat sheet if you change any timings. Another very useful use for the beat sheet is to refresh your memory about the events in the book. If you're talking to an editor or a literary agent or being interviewed about it for a book club, it's incredibly easy to forget a book, even if you've sort of spent years revising it or writing it. If enough time has passed, it will go completely out of your brain. And you'll also forget the reasons why you did things, which is often something that people want to discuss with you. But it's there in the beat sheet why you did things. So it's a quick way to revise the book. So here's the final stage, getting feedback on your manuscript. Who should you get feedback from? Your options are friends, family, other writers, other writing professionals, such as editors or literary agents, writing groups. There is loads you can do yourself, obviously, but there comes a time when you do have to try the manuscript on a few people to see if it works in the way you intended. Some parts will inevitably be a bit overcooked, some undercooked, and even the best self-editor can't see those. And if you're working to a deadline, you might not have as much time as you'd like to be able to see them all. So feedback is essential. So who should you choose? Here is one absolute. They must be people who read your kind of book, or they might steer you in the wrong direction. Is it worth showing your book to friends and family, like my lovely friends there? Yes, provided they're your kind of reader. And here's how to brief them. Just ask them to give you 3 very simple kinds of feedback. Mark the bits that were boring, mark the bits that were confusing, and mark the bits they liked. Don't ask them for suggestions. Their suggestions will rarely be usable unless they have specialist technical knowledge or they've read an awful lot in your kind of genre. But if they're not used to grappling with the hidden machinery of storytelling, they might not understand the suggestions that will actually help you. They will give you them anyway, but you can take less notice of them than of the bits that were boring, the bits that were confusing, and the bits that they liked. So my aims with this course, I want to give you the tools you need to see your work objectively and take real fundamental control of the content. I hope to help you understand, I've helped you understand what makes a book compelling and satisfying, and to help you apply that knowledge to your own particular work, and to see that your manuscript is rough, but it is material. It's a sort of download of a dreaming state of mind that you can then shape into something that works really well for your purposes. And I hope also that it's shown you how to check and shape your manuscript on more than just gut feeling and line by line tweaks. You really need to edit with a true understanding of how your story works and how your characters and plot events and themes and descriptions and genre considerations all work together. And let's have some questions.
Yes, wonderful. I am back. I'm going to start with some of the finer, more specific questions. And then if I do this properly, and I'm sure there will be questions coming in as we go through the Q&A, so I know I won't go exactly according to this plan, but I'm going to try and then telescope out to the more broader issues, especially the psychological issues that I know people have, like feelings of overwhelm. So that I'm saying this as much for the people listening, so they know that I'm not ignoring their questions. So, okay, let me choose a place to begin. Lindsay asks, could you speak a little more about adding, quote, something new to each scene on the beat sheet? What does and doesn't constitute something new?
By that, I presume you mean some change.
Yes.
Yes. Essentially, what the reader thinks you're going to do at the start should not be exactly what you do. So you have to write things so that the end of the scene has ended, the characters or what the reader understands has changed slightly. That's what I mean by something new. So if somebody goes to post a letter and they think they're just going to post a letter and it will be an ordinary experience, and they will set out with maybe with one intention, where they think, I'm going to get that in the letterbox and then it's done. It's impossible to change by then because it will be in the letterbox. Something should have happened that takes that event a little bit further than we were expecting. Does that make sense? So we shouldn't finish the scene thinking, well, she went to post a letter and she's now got that done. There should be something just slightly that moves on as a result of that. Maybe a little bit of regret that the character wasn't expecting to feel. If we've already set it up the reader to expect them to regret it, something else might happen. There's often a little bit of misdirection involved with this kind of situation. You make the reader think they're going to see something, and you show them something slightly different from what they were expecting, and that just keeps them hooked a little bit longer. And it may be very subtle or it may be big, whatever suits that particular stage of your story and whatever suits your genre, whatever you're writing.
There was a recent guest post at my site, was this Monday, that I'm losing track of time, but it was on scene writing. And one of the tips was from Robert McKee's story, where he has kind of a hard rule for screenwriting about a reversal in every scene, which I think that's like a different flavor of what you're talking about.
It's a similar thing, yes. If you find that you're writing and you're thinking the reader knows exactly what's going to happen here, then you should change things. Just a slight change will make them think, oh, you've kept my curiosity.
Excellent. Mary says that you mentioned looking at previous drafts of a scene. One of your suggestions was you might find something there that helps you from that original. She's wondering if you save and edit every single time you're making a change, or maybe you can describe when you think it's worth saving something in its current iteration.
That's a good question. I do end up with enormous outtake files, and I often split them according to which character, which story thread I'm writing about, so that I can go back and find them, because I do go back and look at them. But I'll be editing, and if I think I've got something to a stage where it's looking good, but I think there's more that I can do, then I'll copy it into the outtakes folder. Or I might sort of think, oh, I could reorder this a bit. And usually I don't want to, because I'm thinking I'll have to undo that. And it flows quite well, but there'll be something that nags me to do it. So I'll take a copy. So I've still got that version that flowed quite well. And then I'll go on. And then I'll find, oh, actually, that is quite good. It's sort of when you get to a stage where you think, I don't want to upset this bit. I think it's quite good. I'm quite pleased with what I've done, but there's also something nagging you to have another go because you could get more out of it.
Yeah, excellent. I see there are a couple questions coming in through the chat, and I just want to encourage people to use the Q&A box, since that's where I'm focusing my attention. I may get back to the chat for questions, but if you have posted a question in the chat, if you would copy and paste it over to the Q&A box, that would help me greatly. Okay, so here's a question from Desiree. I know this was at a particular moment when you were speaking, and I hope we can conjure up that moment again. She asked, how can you create action when you're describing your character's thoughts? And Lauren actually builds on that, or she's adding to that question, which I think will help elucidate the issue here. What if the chapter itself is very slow and introspective, like a character stuck in jail? And would it be better to just skip that chapter and wait until it's a more active scene? So I think there's some concern here about, if you're conveying characters' thoughts, how do you make that action oriented?
Right, you're talking about interior action,
right?
Actually, so it's experience, and if a character stuck in jail is a great example. So they might be sitting there isn't much to do, but they will be noticing things, they'll be looking around. Those things will provoke thoughts, or they might just be thinking back over some part of their life. you can make it quite active by having them ask questions of themselves and ask questions about what other people thought about what was happening at the time. So long as what you are showing is interesting, not everything has to be action. I was talking about action as being a good way of starting a book, because it's very easy for the reader to understand and to join in with the character's mental state. So if they're doing something or making a choice, it's easy for the reader to become hooked by what's going on and curious about it and want to know more. But later on, you might well have long scenes of thoughts, the character arguing with themselves, not actually necessarily doing anything that anyone could see from the outside, but there's a lot going on inside. Does that answer your question?
It might, and I'll add on to this. As someone who reads a lot of first pages as part of a query synopsis submissions package, I think one of the problems I see with the beginning, I don't think this is really much of a problem once you get 50 pages in, but with those first 5 pages, if they've got the character like sitting in the what I call the proverbial rocking chair on the front porch and just thinking back over their lives, because it's like this way to get the backstory in, like, you know, and I think I always tell writers, could you not find a better way to open? Like, is that the strongest thing you've got? Because it's totally interior and there's nothing happening other than the characters thinking about their lives. So I guess that would be analogous to the sitting in jail opening. I think for an agent or editor to review the manuscript, I think those openings are harder to engage them with.
Yes, but the novel is it's the best medium for interiority, and it's not something to be afraid of and shy away from.
Good. Nilda says, if a main character is deep down sympathetic, but on the surface horrible, is it a good idea to show the sympathetic part as a hint up front, let it appear later? How do you approach flawed protagonists?
It depends on what you're showing, I suppose. I mean, Blake Snyder has this whole book called Save the Cat, which is basically a way of showing that somebody who's showing that somebody has a human side, a soft side. Showing humanity is a very good way of making flawed people seem interesting and like someone you want to spend time getting to know. Flaws themselves can be very interesting. You can have someone who seems overconfident, and you can see the overconfidence, and that can, for the right kind of book, that can make the reader think, oh, I want to see what trouble this person gets into, and I can see they're going to cause their own trouble. So it very much depends what you're writing, but getting just some humanity in is good in any character introduction, actually.
Let's see. So this question pertains to memoir and prologues. And I certainly have an opinion, but I'll let you go first. So Diane's asking, in memoir, is an author's note similar to a prologue at the beginning as problematic as a fiction prologue? How do you recommend including a bit of personal background and context for the memoir?
Memoir is a thing of its own. Readers are probably more likely to read prefatory material, I think, in a memoir than they are in a novel. In a novel, they might think, oh, I just want to get on with the story. And story is what they want. They want to be absorbed, and they want the things they read about at the start to be the things they are committing to. In a memoir, they know there's a real person. They probably don't mind having things explained to them a little bit. Like I started writing this at a very hard time in my life, sort of thing. That's probably all part of the introduction to the true person that they are engaging with. So I think it's okay.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
I would say as long as it's brief. I've
Yes.
seen authors' notes go on for a little bit too long. I think it also can be particularly important if there are like issues of truth and memory at play, you know, things that you don't remember, there's just some context around how you got this on the page that people need to know, so they feel that like you're being transparent with them, and maybe it helps build trust or honesty. But yeah, it's very dependent on what sort of memoir we're talking about, and all sorts of other factors.
Mm.
All right. Christina says, could you talk about subplots and how to fully develop them?
You have to make sure that they have a beginning, middle, and end, but because they are subordinate to the main plot, they don't have to go through such big ups and downs. Or if they do, because you might have them as a curious kind of contrast to the main plot, they don't have to be as involving to the reader. So you could have a situation where there's sort of quite a mild comedy going on that that is foregrounded, that the reader's really involved in, but there's something much bigger going on in the background that just seems to be a sort of background tapestry and texture, and we don't get involved in them. They still need to seem like they tie up and progress. They don't do they necessarily have to tie all the ends together. We talked about endings in the previous lecture. That depends on what's appropriate for your genre. So in a mystery, all the mysteries usually have to be solved. In something more literary that is not just about the events, you might have some of the threads just go on into infinity because that's more realistic, or that suits your theme better.
Good. And Christina's also wondering regarding your comments before about abandoned books or where you're stuck. And you said, you know, you have to look and see if there's enough story there. And could you give an example or explain further what you mean?
Well, you might find that you abandoned a book because you didn't have enough events, and you knew you didn't have enough events. An abandoned book you usually need to give some tough love to, and you need to have a look at it and see what you can do about it. So you might find that the plot is very thin, and in that case you might decide that plot isn't enough to be a novel, for instance. So you can either think of something bigger for the characters to do, or make that a subplot and think of something completely different. Really, the point of doing a beat sheet of an abandoned book is to figure out why you abandoned it, where you got lost.
Another question, this time about character. This person, I think Miji, I might be butchering the name and I apologize if so. She's intrigued by the idea of creating a character dossier. Any templates that you use or recommend for that?
I tend to make them as I go along. So I keep a note of if I decided on an eye colour, then that would go in the dossier. Sometimes I just decide on the spur of the moment because I need a description of some kind, and I just put what feels right. Other times what I do is I start to think about who might play them if they were in a movie, and that helps me not just visualize them but get a sense of their persona and what it's like to be in their presence. And I find that very useful, and from that I can then build up. That gives me a sense of what they might feel like about another character. So I'll also include who they're upset by, who they feel safe with, and why that might be. So they would be underlying templates for the character's behaviour and their comfort zones and their crumple zones, and all those kinds of details that you wouldn't develop necessarily as part of the story, but that help you write the person with knowledge.
I just have to share a funny, strictly for humor purposes, I had someone really complaining to me recently about character templates that you can find many of these out there if you Google around. And they're really, some of them are like pages and pages long. You can practically buy a workbook, like an 80-page workbook, just to fill out your character information. And this person was complaining to me, who in the world ever uses that much information? It's a total waste of time. It should never be recommended.
They can be helpful. I do have some exercises in the back of my characters book, because I know people like these things. So I thought, well, what would actually be helpful? So I've got a few questions and prompts that you can use to kickstart then your own thought processes about what's important about these people. That's the thing. Get to what's important for you.
Yes. Very good. Martha wonders if you have more advice for dealing with backstory. She has a protagonist with a childhood. That child, all protagonists have childhoods. The childhood is very important to later events, but starting with his past seems too leisurely. Thoughts?
Yes, any instinct you have like that, absolutely listen to it, and see how late you can leave this. But also be aware if you're writing in first person or close third, which is effectively first person but written in third person, that if you hide something and use it later as a sort of twist, oh, a big revelation, this thing happened to me, then the reader will think you knew that all along, so you can't use that as a twist and you've just thrown me out of the book. So you have to strike a balance between giving the reader enough to understand, not overburdening them with stuff, not concealing information unfairly, especially to try and make a plot twist. It's a juggling act. The best thing to do is to learn by reading others. So what I do is when I've decided on a particular kind of thing I'm going to write, I go and find other similar works and just learn from how that author handled them, what worked for me, what didn't work for me. There are no hard and fast rules. It's a question of figuring out how best to use your material. But you're right to not want to put it in too soon. But you could show the effects of the childhood in the character's peculiar behaviour and make us curious about why that behaviour is so odd and why they have these no-go areas and quirks, and then build it that way.
So building on the earlier character question, you've suggested writing a character arc. So can you elaborate further on that, character arcs?
The character arc, it's actually like any story arc. We talked about the plot arcs in the structure section. So you have a beginning, middle, and end, and you have a sort of the beginning is kind of establishing the status quo, and then you have some kind of change they can't go back from, and then you have complications building up and more trouble and then something else happens that means they can't go back, and then you have a big sort of confrontation of everything that's nearly at the end, and then you finally have a resolution. And a character arc looks just like that. A character arc has exactly the same points as a plot arc. You might not want very many of your characters to go through this because it might be extremely hard to choreograph it and extremely hard to make the reader believe that all that can happen to so many people in that world. But it depends on your world. But essentially, a character arc it follows the same template as a plot arc.
So let's talk a little bit about the beat sheet tool or questions relating to the beat sheet. Lindsay asks, is it possible that fixing a scene through the discovery method you described in the beat sheet can be done in simple ways rather than a full rewrite?
Well, every scene acts in relation to its other scenes, and that's why I advocate this overall view. But you might be thinking, where do I start? I don't know my book in that much detail. You do have to do it piece by piece. It's like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. Eventually, you will be able to get the whole elephant in. all at once, because you'll know it so well. And it does indeed start just by fixing one bit or one element. And bit by bit, you start to be able to consider it all as a whole. Something's happened and you've disappeared.
I'm still here.
Oh, you still? Oh, I don't understand. Let me just press escape and stop screen share. There. Yeah. So yes, you start by doing little bits, but they do all affect each other, because every mood you set will affect the way the reader sees what comes later. Every theme that you set running will make the reader pick something up, and every event that happens, the reader will think, oh, this person experienced this, what about that? They are taking it on board as a whole work. So that's why to write the most effective book, you eventually have to have this panoramic view of it, but you can't get it immediately, because you've actually created it up close, almost by looking through a keyhole and only being able to see a tiny bit. Eventually you see the wider picture, but you start, yes, just by doing bit by bit, and you will find if you change a scene, it will have knock-on effects for other ones, but you'll eventually grasp what the whole thing is.
Mm-hmm. So that's going to lead to reshaping the novel a lot. And I know we've answered this question in prior sessions, but Alexandra is wondering about that creation of a second sheet and how many revisions you might go through for the beat sheet.
It depends how many drastic rethinks I've had, but I would do more than one beat sheet, and sometimes I'll do a revision, and if I've got the time, I'll just put the manuscript away for a few months, and then I find that the best way to assess what I now have is to do a fresh beat sheet, see how everything is working, because as I said, it's a state of mind, a state of thinking as well. It's a state of critical thinking about how you are going to do the best for the book. So I would do multiple ones. It depends what I'm writing though, because when I was ghostwriting, I didn't have that kind of time. So I would outline the book, write it in 6 weeks, do a beat sheet immediately. There wasn't any time to just let it sit in a drawer. Do the beat sheet immediately, check all that, plunge straight into rewriting. That would take me another 2 weeks, and then it would go off to the publisher. And then they would check through things. I'd written it to an outline, and also it was a genre book, so it was quite easy to get it right from the start. So you might not need a lot of revisions, but I did find that the beat sheet was a really great way of just seeing the flaws and the extra possibilities in a book that even was quite straightforward.
So that brings me to some of the psychological challenges here, that we've gotten these sorts of questions throughout, and for good reason. It feels overwhelming to some folks to take on this work. And so can you offer tips on how to avoid that feeling of overwhelm?
It really helps to give yourself an overview with the beat sheet, because it gives you a feeling of control. You understand, once you understand how the whole book works, which you get very quickly from doing this, you feel far more in control of it. Another important thing to do is to get used to splitting yourself into splitting your mind into many different kinds of tasks. So when you're writing, you're creating, you're living the thing moment by moment. When you start to revise, the beat sheet lets you just look at things in quite a different way. You, as I said at the beginning, you don't judge whether it works or not. You judge what is there. That's a quite different way of thinking, because mostly what we feel when we go back to the beginning of our text file, you think we've got to revise this, is, oh, that's quite good, or not sure about that, or I'm disappointed with myself. You don't do any of that. you actually see it in quite a different way, as something you are going to have to understand before you can do anything to it. So that really helps. That critical distance is a really good mental tool. And then you think of it in terms of tasks, as I said, with once you've looked at the overall patterns and you think, well, if I move this around here and this here, then that will just work better anyway, and I can get rid of that, and you see things that you can do that are big changes that will make a difference. And then start going through each scene and thinking in terms of just getting one thing right at a time, because as I said, particularly with dialogue is incredibly difficult to do at the same time as anything else. I often find I'll spend a few days on a dialogue scene and I will think by the end of the first day doing it that I got it quite good. I will look at it the second day and I think, oh, this lacks all sorts of depth, so what else do I think should be in there? Just allow yourself to have to take several different mindsets. This is what professional writers do. We do split ourselves into lots of different kinds of people in order to do the writing. We're not always thinking in the same way or looking at the whole thing. You can't necessarily look at the whole scene, how it works, until you've polished the details. But again, if you have a process, you will find you get to a point where you are pretty satisfied, so satisfied enough to be able to show it to someone, and then they can tell you just the little bits that you missed, and they won't be nearly as many as if you didn't embark on this process. This revision process will help you make a book that's much better and much more satisfying to you.
At the very beginning of this class, you talked about something that I think was pretty critical, which is having the courage to do this work.
Yeah.
To smash it all to pieces and then to
Yes.
put it back together. And we do have a question about how you summon that courage and how do you summon the motivation when you realize, when you do this beat sheet, that, oh, like, I have a lot of work ahead. Do you have any psychological tricks?
Oh, several. First of all, I know that the draft I've got is rubbish. It can't remain as it is. It will disappoint me too much. It will not be fit to read. And so I've got to do something about it. I'll make a copy so that nothing I've done has irrevocably changed anything. It's all still there if I need to go back to it. But I know it needs a lot of work on it. And usually I'm thinking, oh, how am I ever going to solve this? And I know from all the writing that I've done, and also all the editing that I've done, how much things can be improved by changing the structure, for instance, which I won't necessarily have got right on the first go. It's really very difficult to get a structure right on the first draft. Unless you're writing something you are very, very used to writing and you have done a lot. People are very practiced at their genre, can do it, but most of us aren't, or some of us are writing a new kind of thing each time. So I know it needs to be done. That's the first thing. It's absolutely got to be done. And then I start, as I get into the work, I find, oh, there are little rewards. That works better than I thought, or, oh, if I move that will be excitingly different and will get me a little bit closer to what I hoped it would be. And it's like that. And I also know from talking to other writers how I've sometimes given them feedback and said, this arc doesn't work, but if you change this around and this around and this around, and they look at me with panic, and I think, well, I know that I can do that without breaking it and without getting completely lost, and I know if I do that, it will be better. So it's a question of it's a bit like deciding to get fit in some ways. There will be a bit of pain, but you will start to feel so rewarded.
Yes, it's very satisfying.
It is
as you see the progress.
Yes.
And maybe we'll end with Joanne's question. You've shared a number of excellent examples during the class, all three. are there any others you might add where you think they're particularly masterful in structure or pace or any of the qualities that you've tried to demonstrate for us?
Off the top of my head, I think William Somerset Maugham is brilliant. It's always difficult to think of things off the top of my head. I recently read, oh God, what's it called? The Painted Veil. And it's a beautiful example of starting with action and just keeping your attention. And you wouldn't think of it from a novelist of that era, but it's just gripping. It's about a woman who is living in the colonies somewhere. They were called the colonies then. She's bored. Her husband is a doctor, and she's just sort of bored and feeling a bit kind of ignored and sorry for herself, and she wished her life was more exciting. So she's having an affair with the local rapscallion, and the novel opens with them being caught in the bedroom. They're there in the bedroom, the door handle turns, and the door was locked, fortunately, but she's saying, that was him. He's come home for lunch, and I didn't think he was coming home. He wasn't supposed to. And the boyfriend is saying, oh, it's all right, it'll be all right. But you can see she is really worried because she's thinking, that's Torrid, that has actually probably ruined my life. He doesn't care about her at all. He's telling, because he does this all the time. Really interesting dynamic situation, and Somerset Maugham just throws you into this. Then you think, who are these people? Why is she such a fool? Why? What's going to happen? And all the way through, he hits you with unexpected events, and it's beautifully done.
Wonderful. Well, Roz, thank you so much for these 3 sessions. As a reminder to everyone who's still with us, we've recorded, and it will be posted with the other 2 recordings by Monday. There will be an email that goes out to remind you or to alert you when the recording's ready, but you're welcome to log in and check anytime. Sometimes we get them ready a little bit sooner than Monday. Roz has other materials, books, and things available. Roz, do you just want to mention if someone wanted to take more of your advice or get more instruction from you, where should they go?
You could go to, I've got several websites actually. I've got rosmorris.org. You could also look up Nail Your Novel, which is my blog, and I've got details of my Nail Your Novel books on there. And also I do consultancy and editing if that's the kind of help you want.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a lovely rest of the week, and I hope to see you in another class soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.